When you were young, were you taught that you shouldn't talk to strangers? Is that advice that you have given to young people in your lives? Talking about the danger. In the 80s, there was the whole phrase, stranger danger. You had to be on your guard all the time. I have to admit, I've kind of given up on this line of advice. I actually really don't find it very helpful. It's not that I rush up to people and really awkwardly try and make friends. Hi, I'm Jim. Can I tell you about Amway? It's like,
Who's Amway?
I don't do that, but I do find that, if you're like me, I surround myself with people with whom I share a connection. Maybe it's church people or hobby people. Maybe it's people who like to read the same books and walk in the same circles. But when you talk to strangers, you get to know people that live a life that seems totally unfamiliar. It's such a great way of bridging the gaps between us even within our own city. It's a wonderful thing to do. Of course, you want to be a bit cautious. If you're talking to children, I always think that instead of saying don't talk to strangers, it's better to teach them which strangers to talk to and where the boundaries are when you talk to strangers. The reading that we have today might just be one of those readings that might encourage you to talk to strangers, because that's what some of the disciples did. And they found a miraculous gift from this conversation. This is from the Gospel according to Luke. Now, on that same day, two of them were going to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem, and talking with each other about all these things that had happened. While they were talking and discussing, Jesus himself came near and went with them, but their eyes were kept from recognizing him. And he said to them, "What are you discussing with each other while you walk along?" They stood still, looking sad. One of them, whose name was Cleopas, answered him, "Are you the only stranger in Jerusalem who does not know the things that have taken place there in these days?" He asked them, "What things?" They replied, "The things about Jesus of Nazareth, who was a prophet, mighty in deed and word before God and all the people, and how our chief priests and leaders handed him over to be condemned to death and crucified him. But we had hoped that he was the one to redeem Israel. Yes, and beside all this, it's now the 3rd day since these things took place. Moreover, some women of our group astounded us. They were at the tomb early this morning, and when they did not find his body there, they came back and told us that they had indeed seen a vision of angels who said that he was alive. Some of those who were with us went to the tomb and found it just as the women had said, but did not see him." Then he said to them, "Oh, how foolish you are, and how slow of heart to believe all the prophets have declared. Was it not necessary that the Messiah should suffer these things, then enter into his glory?" Then, beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted to them the things about himself in all the scriptures. As they came near the village to which they were going, he walked ahead as if he were going on. But they urged him strongly, saying, "Stay with us, because it is almost evening and the day is nearly over." So he went in and stayed with them. When he was at the table with them, he took bread, blessed it, and broke it, and gave it to them. Then their eyes were opened, and they recognized him, and he vanished from their sight. They said to each other, "Were not our hearts burning within us when he was talking to us on the road, while he was opening the scriptures to us?" That same hour they got up and returned to Jerusalem, and they found the 11 and their companions gathered together. They were saying, "The Lord has risen indeed and has appeared to Simon." Then they told what had happened on the road and how he had been made known to them in the breaking of bread. Now, I'm sure that from this story so far, you've gathered that this story takes place shortly after Jesus has been arrested and killed. And they're on this walk, and they find an experience. They find that there's a stranger walking with them who seems to have special insight into what has occurred the last few days. And what an interesting conversation it is. Like, they go right past the small talk. They skip right over who's going to win the Stanley Cup this year. And they go right into talking about how Jesus was arrested and killed. Now, if we're talking about the risk of talking to strangers, this is a risky conversation. What if this stranger is sympathetic to the Roman Empire? Is he going to go and turn them in? Maybe he's going to go and collect a bounty on some Jesus followers by alerting the Roman authorities that these are two of the followers. Arrest them. But this isn't who this person is. This is the risen Christ. But they don't recognize him. They don't know who he is. But still, even not knowing who Jesus is, they put their trust in him. They tell him the story, and eventually they invite him in for a meal. Now, there are many, many parts of the Bible that can be interpreted in different ways, either because the meaning is a little bit fuzzy, or maybe there's different passages that say different things, and a lot of those differences in interpretation probably don't matter to most people at all. Like if you were reading the story of Noah's Ark, how many animals went onto the ark? Was it 2 of each, or was it 2 of some and 6 of others so that Noah could still make sacrifices? Does it matter? Did many of you even know that there was 2 different versions of how many animals there were? But then there are some stories in the Bible that no matter, you may be the most patient, grace-filled, wonderful Christian person in the whole world, but I'll tell you, there are some stories that get shorts in such a knot they will never get untangled. You want to know how many sermons I have preached where I talked about whether or not Mary was really a virgin? None. I like my job. I want to keep my job, so I don't talk about that. Not yet. I actually I trust you folks. You can take some questions. But now as we move into the season of Easter, we have a whole raft of new questions that may come up. And one of the most common questions that comes around these resurrection stories was Jesus' resurrection a spiritual thing that the disciples encountered? Or was this a full-body resurrection? Somebody that craved olives and could stub his toe? I'm sure that a lot of you have very, very definite ideas about which one it is. And I'm not going to tell you that you're wrong. But what I will say is that the Bible is really, really unclear. We have stories of Jesus appearing all of a sudden in locked rooms and then disappearing. But at the same time, we also have stories of Thomas reaching out and touching Jesus. 2 weeks ago, we read the story of the Easter miracle from the book of Matthew. And if you remember, the women show up at the tomb and the stone is still there. An angel comes and rolls that stone away, and Jesus is already gone. So if this is a spiritual resurrection, where'd the body go? But if it's a physical resurrection, then how do you get past the stone? And in most of these stories, his followers, his closest friends, don't recognize him. They can't see, at least at first, that this is Jesus. Something has changed. And this is what happens in this story today. Jesus is right there with them. He's walking with them, talking with them, and they don't recognize who Jesus is. Why would that be? It might be because they understand that life is life and death is death. They have just gone through the trauma of seeing their friend and teacher killed in a political execution, and people don't come back from that. So maybe their minds just will not let them comprehend that Jesus is here. And they are traumatized. In this reading, we find maybe the 3 saddest words in the Bible. Tremendously sad, but also very relatable, because I'm sure that so many of us have also uttered these 3 words at some point in our lives. We had hoped. They had hoped that Jesus was the one to redeem Israel. They had hoped that they would follow him for the rest of their lives as their friend and teacher. They had hoped that he would be the one to get rid of the brutal Roman Empire. They had hoped that he would guide them to this realm of God that he talked about. And then he died before any of this work could be done. They had hoped, and now they don't. But Jesus offers them an alternative narrative. He says, didn't Jesus say that he was going to get killed and then come back? Didn't some of your friends say that they had experienced Jesus? So isn't it just possible that he's not dead? That he's back? Now, the reading doesn't say whether or not this argument had them convinced. But it does say that they continued to walk with him and offer hospitality. And that eventually, after the breaking of the bread, the sharing of hospitality, their eyes were made clear and they saw Jesus in their midst. Now, there is an idea that is pretty much as old as Christianity about how we relate to the risen Christ. And it's one of those ideas that I really don't think we talk enough about. If you go all the way back to St. Augustine, one of the most influential formers of the Christian faith, he talked about how Christ dwells within each and every one of us. He said that Christ is deeper than his most inward being. Many of the saints believe that. Saint Teresa of Avila talked about how within each of us, she used the metaphor of a crystal mansion where Christ dwells with our souls. Julian of Norwich said something very similar. Even more contemporary writers and theologians have talked about this idea that Christ is a part of us. Thomas Merton and Richard Rohr talk about how our most authentic selves are found in the internal, inward being of Christ. How even beyond humanity, this cosmic Christ exists within all things, that Christ imbues all of creation. This is not some new agey woohoo kind of stuff. This is as old and as traditional as Christianity itself. So what if this might explain partially what the disciples were experiencing on that Easter miracle? They're walking along and they find a stranger. Now, when Luke uses the word stranger, the word is actually more accurately translated as migrant or foreigner. This guy isn't even from here, but somehow this is the living Christ. What if, when they experience this person and they share hospitality, this person all of a sudden is recognized to be a vessel of this internal Christ? What if that person is the stranger, isn't the physical Jesus person, but is the living Christ, has that spark of divinity? What if in those locked rooms where they were huddled together and afraid and traumatized, they looked at their friends and recognized that Christ was there with them in each other? What if we looked at each other and saw the risen Christ as a divine essence of who we are as people? There's an idea in theology, if you go to take some university classes, they will talk about how the Bible is written for us to be better neighbors to each other. That the Bible is there to teach us to be more loving, more neighborly, more compassionate, more forgiving people. That is its purpose. And so we can judge the quality of our interpretations by whether or not our interpretation makes us better people. If you're looking for a word to impress your friends at a dinner party, there's actually a phrase for this. It's called, I've lost the name. Never mind, don't impress your friends. Oh, retroductive warrant. That's the phrase that this means.
What is it?
Retroductive warrant. You don't need to memorize it. There's not going to be a quiz. But what the retroductive warrant tells us is that if my interpretation of the Bible causes me to hate my neighbor, to be less grace-filled, less patient, then by necessity, my interpretation must be wrong. Whereas if my interpretation causes me to be more loving of my neighbor, to be more forgiving, to be more generous, to see each other as people that are God's gift to creation, then there may be something to my interpretation. If that is really how we are supposed to read the Bible, then how would seeing the living embodiment of Christ in each other, how would that change us? Imagine if just the 2.5 billion Christians in the world today looked at all of their neighbors and saw in their neighbors the face of Christ. How would that change the world? War and hatred and greed would be completely unimaginable. Because to kill my neighbor is to kill a divine spark of Christ. If we see in a mirror and see a person in the mirror, that can be that day the face of Christ for somebody who just needs a little bit of love on that day. If that's how you saw yourself, how would you then proceed through your day, given that potential? If we see each other as carriers of the living Christ, then we can't help but be more loving, be more compassionate, to stranger, to foreigner, to friend, to people around the world. See the face of Christ in each other and in yourself. And never again will anybody ever have to say, "We had hoped."